6 miles. That was how far Shulon Ding had walked since the merchant Otis Pemberton stood in front of half of Dry Creek and told her the wedding was off. And every one of those miles had been on foot, in the flat, white heat of a Wyoming summer, with nothing to her name but the clothes on her back and a hunger she had stopped trying to ignore around mile 3. She saw the ranch house before she saw the man sitting on its porch, a long, low building with smoke curling thin from the chimney despite the heat, and by the time she had crossed the last stretch of dry grass to the yard, her legs had gone unsteady enough that she had to stop at the bottom of the porch steps and simply breathe a moment before she trusted her voice. The rancher, watching her from his chair, did not rise, did not reach for the rifle propped within easy reach of his hand, only studied her with the plain, unhurried attention of a man deciding what kind of trouble had walked onto his land. "Help you with something?" "I can cook." It was not what she had planned to say, but hunger and exhaustion had worn away everything but the plainest truth in her. "I have not eaten today, and I have nowhere in Dry Creek that will have me back. If I can feed you, sir, let me stay." He looked at her a long moment before he spoke, the kind of look that took its time rather than rushing to a judgment, and something in the careful weighing of it told her this was not a man who had decided anything about her yet, which was more than Dry Creek had managed in the 3 days since Otis Pemberton called off the wedding in front of the whole town. "Caleb Marsh," he said finally, standing, "you'd best come in before you fall down out here. Kitchen's through the back. I've got flour, salt pork, and not much notion what to do with either past burning it." She followed him inside on legs that trembled with relief as much as hunger, and it was there, in a kitchen that had clearly not seen a woman's steady hand in some time, that Shulon Ding began the work that would, in the months to come, remake more than a single meal. The kitchen told its own story before she ever touched a pot. Dust lay thick on shelves that had once held a woman's careful arrangement of jars and tins, the arrangement long since scattered by a bachelor's indifferent hand, and the stove itself had gone cold-cornered and neglected in a way that spoke of a man who cooked only enough to keep from starving, and no more than that. She found flour gone slightly stale in its tin, salt pork hanging from a hook by the window, and enough scattered supplies to piece together a meal, though it took her longer than she would have liked to locate a working knife sharp enough to trust with the pork. She told him the plain shape of it while she worked, because he did not press her for it, and yet seemed to be waiting anyway, in the patient way of a man who understood that some things came out easier when a person's hands were busy with something else. "My family arranged the match through a broker in San Francisco. Otis Pemberton sent for a bride the way another man sends for seed corn, expecting a wife who would keep his store accounts and never once question how he kept them." She turned the salt pork in the pan, the fat popping soft against the heat. "3 days after I arrived, he discovered the dowry my family sent was smaller than the broker had promised him. He announced in front of half the town that he had been cheated and that I was no wife of his, and he put my trunk out on the boardwalk before I had finished unpacking it." "Man ought to be ashamed, doing a woman that way in front of a whole town." "Shame requires a man to believe he has done something wrong. Otis Pemberton believes only that he was cheated of money he was owed, and that whatever he does in response is simply fair accounting." She set the pan aside, the smell of it filling the small kitchen for the first time in what looked like months. "I do not expect you to fix that, Mr. Marsh. I only asked for a meal and a roof, until I decide where 6 miles in the wrong direction ought to take me next." "You can decide that with a full stomach same as an empty one. No sense deciding anything important on 3 days and nothing." He said it plainly, without making more of the kindness than the words themselves carried, and Shulon understood, watching him eat the first honest meal she suspected he had had in a long while, that this was a man who measured his words the same careful way he seemed to measure everything else. The days that followed took on their own rhythm, the kind that grows between two people who have decided, without much discussion, that an arrangement suits them both. Shulan cooked, mended, and turned the neglected kitchen garden back into something worth tending, while Caleb Marsh worked his herd and said little, though she noticed he had taken to lingering at supper longer than the meal itself required, and to finding small excuses to pass through the kitchen at hours when no excuse was strictly needed. She learned the shape of the ranch in those first 2 weeks the way she had once learned the shape of her family's household back in San Francisco, by paying close attention rather than by being told. Caleb ran perhaps 300 head on grazing land that stretched further than she could see from the porch, kept 2 hired hands who came through for meals but slept in a bunkhouse a good distance from the main house, and carried himself with the particular quiet of a man who had learned to manage a large operation mostly alone, out of necessity rather than preference. The garden, once she had cleared 3 summers of neglect from it, gave up tomatoes and beans faster than she could put up preserves for the coming winter, and by the second week she had the kitchen running with the same steady order she had once kept for a household considerably less kind to her than this one. It was on her second Sunday at the ranch that Dry Creek made its opinion of the arrangement known. Caleb had ridden into town for supplies and brought her along, over her own hesitation, insisting plainly that a woman ought not have to hide in a kitchen simply because a town had decided to be small about her presence in it. The general store fell into the particular silence that Shulan had come to recognize as the sound of a room deciding, all at once, what it thought of her. The store's owner, a narrow man named Silas Renfro, addressed his first words not to her, but past her, to Caleb, as though she were furniture that had wandered in on its own. "Didn't expect you'd take in Pemberton's leavings, Marsh." "She's not anybody's leavings, Renfro. She's keeping my house, and doing it a sight better than I ever managed alone." Caleb's voice stayed level, but something in it had gone flat and hard. "You've got business with her. Address it to her face. Otherwise, keep your opinions about my household to yourself." Renfro's mouth thinned, but before he could answer, the store's door opened behind them, and Otis Pemberton himself stepped through it, stopping short at the sight of Shulan standing calm beside Caleb Marsh, dressed plain but steady, in a store he had clearly not expected to find her in. "Well, now," Pemberton's voice carried the particular pleasantness of a man who believed himself owed an apology and intended to collect one. "Didn't take you for a fool, Marsh, taking in a woman who cost me a small fortune in broker's fees before I discovered what her family actually sent." "I didn't take her in over any fortune, Pemberton. I took her in because she was starving on my porch step, and you'd thrown her out onto a public street like she was spoiled goods instead of a person." Caleb's stance had not changed, but something in the set of his shoulders had. A stillness that Shulan recognized, even in the short time she had known him, as the particular calm of a man who had already decided how far he was willing to let a conversation go before he stopped being calm about it. "You want your money back, take it up with the broker who arranged the match. You don't get to take it up with her, not while she's under my roof." "Your roof." Pemberton's eyes moved to Shulan with an expression that made something cold settle low in her stomach. "That an arrangement with terms, Marsh, or are you simply feeding a stray out of the goodness of your heart?" "It's an arrangement that's none of your business, same as it was none of the whole town's business the day you put her trunk out on the boardwalk for every soul in Dry Creek to gawk at." Caleb took a half step forward, close enough that Pemberton's pleasant expression flickered for the first time. "I'd suggest you finish your errand and get gone before I decide your business with me runs deeper than a simple exchange of words." Pemberton did not press it further, though the look he gave Shulan on his way out carried a promise she did not much care for the shape of, and she found herself standing very still in the middle of the general store, aware for the first time of how thoroughly Caleb Marsh had just planted himself between her and a town that had already decided, before she ever spoke a word to any of them, exactly what she was worth. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was not uncomfortable so much as full, the kind of quiet that comes after two people have witnessed something true about each other that neither had quite expected. The dust rose soft behind the wagon wheels, and the late afternoon heat had begun to soften toward evening by the time the ranch house came back into view, its low roof line a welcome sight after the tension of the general store. "You didn't have to stand up to him like that," she said finally, as the ranch house came into view. "It will cost you standing in that town, defending a woman Otis Pemberton has already decided is worth defending against." "Let it cost me. A man who won't stand up for what's right in his own kitchen on account of what the general store thinks isn't much of a man at all." He glanced over at her. "Besides, Renfro's opinion of my household arrangements has never once put supper on my table or kept my accounts straight, and yours has done both inside of 2 weeks." "That is a practical reason to defend a housekeeper, Mr. Marsh. It is not, I think, the whole of your reason." He did not answer that directly, though something in his jaw tightened in a way she was beginning to recognize as the shape of a man working through a thought he was not yet ready to say aloud, and the silence that followed carried its own kind of honest answer, even without words attached to it. The following week brought its own small trial, one that had nothing to do with Otis Pemberton at all. A summer storm rolled in fast off the western ridge one afternoon, the kind that Wyoming produced with little warning and considerable violence, and Caleb was out working the far pasture when the wind picked up hard enough to send loose shingles clattering off the barn roof. Shulon had been hanging linens in the yard when the first heavy gust hit, and she looked up to see the barn door, left unlatched by one of the hands, swinging wide and slamming against a frame with a force that threatened to tear it from its hinges entirely. She ran for it without stopping to think whether it was her place to, catching the door on its next swing and throwing her whole weight against it long enough to drop the latch bar into place, the wood biting hard enough into her palms that she would carry the mark of it for days afterward, a small price against the alternative of losing tack and tools to a storm she could have stopped simply by moving fast enough to meet it. By the time Caleb rode in hard through the rain that had finally broken loose from the clouds, she had already moved the loose tools from the yard into the tool shed, and was working her way back toward the house, soaked through but steady on her feet. "You didn't have to do that alone." He swung down, checking her hands where the latch bar had bitten into them, his thumb tracing the raw mark across her palm with a gentleness that surprised her more than the storm itself had. "Could have waited on me." "The barn would have lost that door by the time you rode in, and likely half the tack stored behind it besides. I did not see the sense in waiting on damage I could prevent simply by moving faster than the wind." She flexed her stinging palms. "I have spent enough of my life waiting on someone else to fix what was breaking in front of me. I would rather act and explain myself after than stand still and watch something I could have stopped." He looked at her a long moment, rain still dripping from his hat brim, something working behind his eyes that she could not entirely read, and then he said, quiet enough that the storm nearly swallowed it, "I'm starting to think there isn't much this ranch could throw at you that you wouldn't find some steady way through." It was 2 weeks later, on an evening when the heat had finally broken into something gentler, and the two of them sat on the porch after supper the way they had taken to doing most nights, that Caleb told her the thing he had been carrying since her arrival, unprompted, in the plain, unhurried way he seemed to tell everything that mattered to him. "My wife died 3 years back. Fever, same as took half the valley that summer. I built this porch the year before, thinking we'd sit out here together most evenings once the ranch was settled enough to allow for sitting." He looked out at the darkening grass rather than at her. "Never did get much use out of it until you came walking up out of the heat, asking to cook for your supper. Feels strange, sitting here again with someone, after 3 years of sitting here alone." "What was her name, if you do not mind my asking?" "Ruth." He said it plainly, the way a man says a name he has kept careful and private for a long while, not yet ready to let it wear soft from too much handling by other tongues. "She had a way of running this kitchen you'd have found familiar, I think. Same particular way of setting things right without making a fuss over having done it." "I am sorry for your loss." She said it plainly, without the softness that might have made it sound like pity, because she understood, from her own grief over a life left behind in San Francisco, that plain honesty was the only kind of sympathy worth offering. Grief does not leave simply because a porch gets used again. "No, but it eases some, having reason to use it." He turned to look at her fully then. "I want you to know the offer of shelter was never a trade I expected repayment for, beyond the cooking itself. Whatever else has grown up alongside it these past weeks, that came free and unasked, same as your knock on my porch step did." She understood what he was saying, and what he was carefully not saying outright, and found she did not want to make him say it plainer than he already had. Not yet. Not while the wound of Otis Pemberton's public humiliation was still fresh enough to make trust feel like a thing she had to earn back slowly rather than accept freely. "I would like to stay a while longer," she said instead, "and see what grows, unasked, in its own good time." It was not long after that the trouble found them properly, the kind Shulan had feared since the moment Otis Pemberton's eyes had settled on her in the general store with that promise she had not cared for the shape of. Pemberton rode out to the ranch on a Thursday with 2 men Shulan did not recognize, hard-faced strangers who sat their horses like men more accustomed to collecting debts than working cattle, and the moment she saw them from the kitchen window, something cold and familiar settled into her stomach. She had just finished setting bread to rise when the sound of hooves crossing the yard drew her to the window, and one look at the 3 riders told her plainly enough that this was not a social call. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the front room, catching Caleb's eye through the doorway as he rose from where he had been mending harness leather, and the look that passed between them needed no words at all to convey that both of them understood exactly what kind of trouble had just ridden onto the property. Marsh. Pemberton did not dismount, which she understood, watching Caleb come out onto the porch with his rifle left deliberately inside the door as a small calculated insult in itself. "Come to collect what's owed me. Turns out the dowry her family sent wasn't just short. Half of it was counterfeit script, which makes the whole arrangement fraud under territorial law. And fraud means I've got a legal claim on anything of value that came west with her, which by my count includes the woman herself, until the debt's settled proper." "That's not how territorial law works, Pemberton, and you know it." Caleb's voice had gone very still. The particular flatness Shulan had learned meant he was holding something dangerous on a short lead. "A woman's not property to be seized against a debt, whatever fool notion you've talked yourself into. Ask the marshal in Cheyenne next time you're through that way. Marriage contracts get treated a good deal like property contracts out here when there's fraud involved on one side of the bargain. I've got a lawyer's letter says so, and I mean to collect what's mine, one way or another." Pemberton's pleasant tone had thinned to something considerably uglier. "You can hand her over quiet, Marsh, or my men here can help me collect her the hard way. Either way, I'm not riding off this ranch without what I came for." The 2 hired men had spread out slightly on their horses, one drifting toward the barn side of the yard, the other keeping his position near the porch steps, the practiced movement of men who had done this kind of collecting before and knew how to box a person in without seeming to hurry about it. Shulan felt the shape of the trap settling around her even before either man moved further, and something in her chest went cold and clear, the same clarity she remembered from the morning Otis Pemberton had put her trunk out on the boardwalk in front of the whole town. Shulon stepped out onto the porch before Caleb could answer, her hands steady, though her heart was slamming hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "You have no lawyer's letter, Mr. Pemberton. You have a bluff and a pair of hired men, and a belief that a woman standing alone has no recourse against 3 men on horseback." She kept her voice level, the same steadiness she had used the day she first stepped up to Caleb Marsh's porch with nothing left but honesty. "But I am not standing alone, and territorial law does not permit a man to seize a person as payment for a debt, fraudulent or otherwise, whatever your lawyer may have written to make you feel otherwise justified." "Pretty speech for a woman about to get dragged off a porch." One of the hired men had already swung down from his horse, moving toward the steps with the easy confidence of a man who did not expect resistance to matter much. What happened next happened fast enough that Shulon understood it only in pieces afterward. Caleb moved off the porch in a single motion, putting himself squarely between the advancing man and the steps, and when the man reached for his arm to shove him aside, Caleb caught the wrist instead, twisting it hard enough that the man went down onto one knee with a sharp cry, more surprised than injured, but thoroughly stopped regardless. "You'll want to reconsider whatever Pemberton's paying you for this," Caleb said, not raising his voice, "because I've got neighbors within earshot of a rifle shot, and every one of them would come running a good deal faster for me than for 3 strangers dragging a woman off a porch in broad daylight." The second hired man had not moved from his horse, weighing, Shulon could see, whether the money Pemberton was paying was worth the trouble now visibly unfolding in front of him. And Pemberton himself had gone very quiet, his earlier confidence thinning fast now that his bluff had met something that refused to bend to it. "This isn't finished, Marsh." Pemberton's voice had lost its pleasant edge entirely. "I'll have the marshal out here inside the week with a proper writ, and we'll see how your neighbors feel about harboring a fraud once there's real paper behind the claim instead of just my word. You do that, and when the marshal asks to see this counterfeit script you're so certain exists, you'd best have more than your own say-so to show him, because I've a notion a real fraud investigation is going to turn up considerably more about your own bookkeeping than it ever turns up about hers." Caleb released the kneeling man's wrist, stepping back onto the porch beside Shulon. "Get off my land, Pemberton, before I decide the neighbors ought to hear about this visit sooner rather than later." Pemberton gathered his men and rode off without another word, though the look he threw over his shoulder promised the matter was far from settled, and Shulon found her hands shaking now that the danger had passed, the same delayed trembling she remembered from the day her trunk had landed on the Dry Creek boardwalk. "He is not bluffing about the marshal," she said quietly, once the dust from their departure had settled and her hands had finally stopped their trembling. "Whatever else is a lie, that part he will follow through on, out of spite if nothing else." "Let him bring the marshal. A real investigation into that counterfeit script is going to land considerably harder on Pemberton's own ledgers than on anything of yours, and I expect he knows it, which is exactly why he came out here with hired men instead of a lawyer in the first place." Caleb looked at her, something steady and certain in his face that had not been there before the confrontation. "You did not stand there quiet and let 3 men decide your fate for you. Whatever else this territory thinks it knows about what a woman ought to do in a moment like that, you proved every one of them wrong." "I have spent my whole life being told what a woman in my position ought to do quietly. I decided some while back that quietly was not going to be the whole of my answer anymore." She met his eyes, steady despite the fading tremor still working through her hands. "Thank you, Caleb, for not asking me to be quiet just now, when quiet would have been the easier road for you to walk." "Never once occurred to me to ask it." The words came out plain, the same plain honesty he had offered her from the very first evening on his porch, unadorned by anything softer or more practiced, and something in the way he said it settled a question in her that she had been carrying since the day Otis Pemberton first spoke her worth aloud in front of a whole town, and found it, at last, answered otherwise. The marshal did ride out from Cheyenne inside the week, same as Pemberton had promised, but the investigation that followed turned exactly the direction Caleb had predicted it would. A careful review of Pemberton's own store ledgers, prompted by the marshal's inquiry into the supposed counterfeit dowry, turned up considerably more troubling discrepancies in Pemberton's dealings with the very broker who had arranged Shulan's match. Discrepancies that suggested Pemberton had been shorting the broker's fees for more than a year running, using brides sent west as a convenient excuse to explain away money that had gone missing from his own accounts long before Shulan Dang ever arrived in Dry Creek. The marshal himself was a weathered, unhurried man named Cyrus Whitlow, who spent 2 full days going through Pemberton's ledgers line by line at the store counter, asking Shulan directly about the dowry arrangement rather than accepting Pemberton's account of it second hand, and writing down her answers with the same careful attention he gave to the numbers themselves. She answered plainly, laying out the broker's original letter and the sum her family had actually sent, and by the second day it had become clear to anyone watching that the numbers Pemberton claimed did not square with any honest reading of the paper trail. 3 months passed, and the matter of Otis Pemberton settled itself the way most matters built on bluff and bad bookkeeping eventually do, under the plain weight of an honest examination. The territorial marshal's inquiry expanded into Pemberton's broader dealings, and by early autumn the store had changed hands entirely, sold off to settle debts that had nothing at all to do with any counterfeit dowry, and everything to do with years of Pemberton's own quiet theft finally catching up to him. Silas Renfro, who had once addressed his words past Shulan as though she were furniture, took over the running of the general store himself once Pemberton's affairs were settled, and whatever his private opinions remained, he had learned enough from watching a marshal's investigation unravel a man's whole reputation to keep those opinions considerably more guarded than before. The 2 hired men Pemberton had brought out to the ranch that Thursday, it turned out, had never been paid the full sum they were promised for the trouble, and both had given testimony to the marshal readily enough once it became clear Pemberton's money was not the sure thing they had believed it to be. The Marsh Ranch, meanwhile, bore the plainest proof of a different kind of change. The kitchen garden Shulan had coaxed back to life that first fortnight had filled the root cellar twice over by harvest time, and the porch that Caleb had built 3 years before for evenings he never got to use now saw regular company most nights, the 2 of them sitting out past sundown the way he had once described wanting to before grief had taken that plan away from him for 3 long years. Shulan found him there on an evening in late September, the same porch where she had first stopped to catch her breath after 6 miles of walking with nothing left to her name but hunger and honesty. "Renfro nodded to me in the store today," she said, sitting down beside him. "First time since Pemberton put my trunk out on that boardwalk." Town's got a short memory for gossip once the gossip turns out to be wrong. Pemberton's the one they're all whispering about now, not you. Caleb turned to face her. Funny thing, watching a whole town rearrange its opinion of a person once the facts finally catch up to the talk. 3 months back, half of Dry Creek wouldn't meet your eye. Now half of 'em can't stop asking after your garden. Opinions built on nothing sturdier than a man's say-so were never going to hold once something true stood up against them. She settled into the chair beside his, the boards creaking familiar beneath her now, after months of evenings spent in exactly this spot. "I never did finish saying what I meant to say that first evening you told me about your family's arrangement, about what grew up unasked, in its own good time. You said you wanted me to know the shelter came free, whatever grew alongside it." She recalled the words plainly, the same way she recalled every plain thing this man had ever told her, unadorned and therefore easier to trust than anything dressed up prettier would have been. "I did, and plenty's grown since then, unasked, same as I promised, but I find I'm not content any more to leave it unasked forever." He took her hand. the same careful way he had caught the hired man's wrist that Thursday afternoon, gentle now instead of forceful. "I'm asking you plain, Shulon. Stay not as my housekeeper, and not as a woman who once knocked on my porch step, half-starved and looking for shelter. Stay as my wife, if you'll have a rancher who's spent 3 years sitting on a porch built for company he thought he'd never get to keep again." She looked out at the ranch, spread gold and quiet in the last of the evening light, at the garden that had fed them both through a hard summer, at the man beside her who had stood between her and 3 armed strangers without a single moment's hesitation, and she found the answer settling in her the same plain, unhurried way every true thing about this ranch had settled since the day she first walked up out of the heat. She thought of the 6 miles she had walked that first day, footsore and starving, certain she had nothing left in the world worth keeping, and how strange it was that those same 6 miles had delivered her to exactly the place she had not known she was looking for. She thought of Otis Pemberton's pleasant, ugly voice in the general store, and of the storm that had nearly torn the barn door from its hinges, and of every small trial the summer had handed her, each one met and answered rather than simply endured. "Yes," she said, the word coming out steadier than she expected, given how much of herself she was placing behind it. "I will stay, and I will feed you and mend for you, and sit this porch with you most evenings for as long as you'll have me, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I have finally found somewhere I choose to stay." He did not kiss her there on the porch, not with the evening chores still finishing within sight of the yard, but he held her hand steady in the fading light, over a ranch that had been quietly, thoroughly remade by a woman who had walked 6 miles on nothing but hunger and honesty, over a garden grown thick with the season's harvest, and a kitchen that no longer sat cold and neglected, and found, at the end of that long walk, a door that never once asked her to be anything less than exactly who she was. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.